It's time for the Phil Ferguson Show.
This is Phil Ferguson, and you are listening to The Phil Ferguson Show. Later in the show, we're going to have our interview with Jeff Sharlet. He is the author of two really well-known and New York Times bestseller books. One is The Family, and the other one is C Street. And they both talk about a very maniacal, secretive, and powerful religious organization that I think started way back in 1935. And how it moved to Washington, D.C., and it has grown and continues to grow in power. And they're the ones that actually run the National Prayer Breakfast, by the way. So you're going to want to listen to that interview. And we will also tie discussion of these books, which came out almost 10 years ago, into a brand new article written by Jeff Sharlet in Vanity Fair, a wonderful article that you should read, which explains how Trump fits into all of this. Because if you thought that the religious right in the United States cared about family values, if you thought that they really cared about abortion, they don't. They care about power. And it's the use of religion and politics to gain power for the very sake of having power. And anyway, I don't want to go into that now because you will listen to that and be amazed, and I think you're going to enjoy the crap out of it. The other thing today is investing, Skeptically segment, the Polaris Plan Part 5. And in that, I am going to talk about international stock funds and REIT, Real Estate Investment Trust Fund from Vanguard, and how they fit into the overall portfolio and how you might want to split up your international investments into the funds that I recommend. Of course, none of this is specific investment advice for you. It's just some ideas just to help you understand how my model works, and maybe how you can use it for your own personal advantage. I do, of course, get a lot of emails, and I have two that I wanted to cover. Well, I guess one I wanted to cover with you. No, there are two. I'm sorry. One was someone pointed out, did some research, and found out that some overlap does exist with Vanguard U.S. stock index funds. I had made a statement, something along the lines of the large cap growth fund and the large cap value fund have zero overlap. I was wrong. They do have some overlap. Thankfully, it's incredibly small and not significant. That's per the email from the listener, and they're probably right. I'm absolutely sure that they're right, and that I overstepped to say that there's absolutely no overlap. I think what I'll have to say going forward is there's virtually no overlap, so that a stock that maybe moves from value to growth is not necessarily instantaneously sold by the value index fund and instantaneously all bought by the large cap growth fund. There's some time where those funds have to buy in or clear out their positions. But the overlap at Vanguard is quite small, virtually non-existent. How's that? We'll go with that. The other topic, I had a listener write in and said, you're giving all these funds and everything. How about if I just use the Vanguard Total Bond Index Fund, the U.S. Total Stock Index Fund, and the Total International Stock Index Fund, because it's going to cover all the stuff that you recommend, and it's going to have all the pieces that you recommend. And that's really easy. So why don't I just do that? And it's not a bad idea. It's not a bad idea at all. It just doesn't work as well. And if you want to hear specific mathematical details on that, I'm going to recommend show 328. And this is going back to, I'm pretty sure, January-ish of 2020. And it's something I do every single year, at least I have for the last 4 years. It is a review of, it's called the 14-year performance. And of course, the year before I did 13 years and iterations back in time. The first one I did was 10-year performance because I had 10 years worth of data. Getting specific data that's older than 10 years at any time is really hard. It's out there and you can get it and pay for it. And people who write really well done investing books like the ones I recommend, they go and get that data or they have access to that data because of the work that they do. But you as an average person, how do you go find out what the Vanguard Small Cap Value Fund did 13 years ago for that year? It's not very easy to find. And maybe I'm missing something. If you know how to find it, let me know. But I have all that data because 4 years ago, I started with a 10-year history and I've added to it every year. And in that 14-year performance, I show a theoretical example of someone that has $1 million. They're now at retirement, and they're going to start taking out $50,000 a year. And we run forward through time to see how that person has done over 14 years. Keeping in mind, of course, if you go back to that show, and it does warn you in the show, don't put too much value into it because I did the calculations. So I could be biased. I could be tricking you. I could be tricking myself and thinking you that I'm giving you the most cleanest, bestest version of it. But it talks about 4 different strategies one can use in retirement. And one of them is what this listener was talking about. And that's often called the 3-legged stool, where you have the total bond fund, the total U.S. stock fund, and the total international stock fund. And those 3 legs of the stool. And you decide what percentage you want each one of those 3 positions. And every year, you either add money or take out money, and you rebalance. It's easy, it's quick, and it does pretty well, I have to admit. But I think one can do better. Also in that show is a comparison of a target date fund from Vanguard. There's also a comparison. What would happen if you used only stocks, only U.S. stocks? Really simple. And that one's the winner, by the way, that has the absolute best results. However, you are 100% in the stock market. So if you get some point in the future, not that I'm predicting it, but if you get some point in the future where you lose 20, 30, 40% in a stock market, and it doesn't bounce back like it did in 2020, but it stays down for a year or two, and you're in retirement, you have a problem. Because now you're really eating into the meat of your portfolio by selling the stocks while they're down 30, 40%. And you don't want to do that. That's why you want to have the cushion. And then, of course, the fourth is what I now call, I guess, the Polaris plan with all of the, well, not all of it, many of the nuances, because 14 years ago, Vanguard did have a small cap index fund, but they did not have a small cap growth index fund and a small cap value index fund. So the current model is actually more granular, more robust, and it's always subject to change, but there's more funds than what I even had in that 14-year performance review from January of 2020. Again, show 328. The other thing that I wanted to cover before we get into the regular segments is that I sometimes get emails inside the industry about what's going on and who gets sued and who did the bad thing. And a broker-dealer came up, and I'm not going to mention their name, that they were charging clients a wrap fee. And you probably don't know what a wrap fee is, and why would you? But a wrap fee is a fee that you pay to not pay other fees. I know it's kind of wacky, but if you're at a broker-dealer, for example, and where this normally would come up, and they think that they know which stocks are good and which stocks aren't good, and they buy you a basket of 50 or 60 or 70 or 100 stocks. And I've seen this, and I've had people bring me their portfolios, and it's just all these stocks. And I'll ask, why do you have all these stocks? And they go, I don't know. But if you pay this fee that looks a lot like the fee you might pay for an advisor, then you don't pay for the transaction costs of $25, $50, $100, whatever, to buy these stocks. Because usually, not always, an advisor that recommends 100 different stocks to you is always going to be changing the recommendations. And part of it is because it's driven by the psychology of the average investor that looks at it and says, why haven't you adjusted something? Why haven't you done something? And I have sometimes, especially with a smaller portfolio, where a client will say, you've not moved anything for an entire year. Why am I paying you? I said, you're paying me because you're already in the right place. There's no need for me to go change things because I don't get anything extra from a trade or a transaction by fucking around with your portfolio. If it was good when I made the investments and it's still good today, in my opinion, and I can be wrong, why would I go trade things? Why would I do that? Especially if you're in a taxable account. You're going to pay a lot of taxes on the buys and sells. But this brokerage firm was charging that wrap fee, which is often 1 to 1.5%. And then they weren't using individual stocks. They were using mutual funds, which again doesn't necessarily mean that there's a problem, although I don't like that. But in this case, the advisor, the broker-dealer, was collecting the wrap fee and then putting into clients' accounts mutual funds that have no transaction costs to buy. And this is one of the things that every once in a while causes some heartburn with people, because I use TD Ameritrade to buy Vanguard index funds, because Vanguard does not support advisors doing what I am doing. It doesn't work that way. So the individual investor might have to pay $24, $27, whatever it is, every time I buy or sell a Vanguard index fund, because TD Ameritrade doesn't do all this shit for free. They can't send you the forms, the documents, the legally required things, if they're not getting money from somewhere. And so they get the money from that trade. But there are mutual funds called NTF funds. And matter of fact, it's most, if not almost all, funds have no transaction costs to buy or sell, at least no transaction costs that you see. So if you have an account at Fidelity and you want to buy a fund from T. Rowe Price, it's probably an NTF, no transaction fee fund. And you buy it and you didn't have to pay anything to Fidelity to make that trade. Well, okay. Fidelity doesn't do that for free, right? They're not in the charity business. They're there to make money. And so T. Rowe Price has agreed to pay Fidelity the transaction fee that you should have paid that you now don't see. So Fidelity still gets paid. They get paid by T. Rowe Price. And T. Rowe Price pays them with money out of the fund that you just bought into. Which, okay, not necessarily bad, but if other people are jumping in and out of those funds, all of those transaction fees are paid by all of the investors in that fund, including you. So you think that maybe you save $25 by not paying a transaction fee, but in reality, you end up paying more or getting a smaller return on your entire portfolio because you keep paying for everyone else's transaction fees. So that's why I like fees to be upfront, clear, and obvious, and you know what you're paying, and you can choose to not pay it. But when it's hidden, you don't know that it's there. And back to this broker-dealer with this wrap fee, they were charging a wrap fee and then using investments that did not have direct fees to the clients anyway. So it would not have cost the client anything to buy the investments that the advisor bought, but the investor paid 1 to 1.5% to avoid fees, which turned out to be zero, at least as far as direct fees. And then you're put in the funds that are paying the broker-dealer for other people to get in and out. Take it a step worse. This advisor was also putting people in mutual funds that had what's called a profit-sharing agreement. I know, it's so funky. It's hard to even imagine. Where the mutual fund splits part of the profit that they make from your money with the advisor as kind of a commission-y kind of a way to reward them for putting you into it. So you paid a wrap fee to avoid fees that don't exist to be put in the funds that split part of the profit, and that's not necessarily, quote unquote, a commission to the advisor that put you in it. And so the advisor gets paid by you and by the funds that they really actually work for to put your money in those funds. And that's crazy, wacky bullshittery. And I'm not sure exactly what the line is for legal, but these guys crossed it. And it's just one of those things in the industry that just drives me nuts. You have to know exactly what you're paying for. And often when look at other people's portfolios or talk to them about the wrap fee, they are convinced, because they've probably been told, that once you pay this wrap fee, you don't have any other expenses. Bullshit. There's no way that that's fucking possible. Even if you pay the wrap fee and they put you in a Vanguard index fund, the Vanguard index fund has a published expense ratio. On top of the published expense ratio, there are other expenses the mutual fund will have to pay, like trading costs. When they adjust the index fund, you pay for that shit too. Because nobody does any of this shit for free. It all comes out of your pocket. So you want to be able to see what you're paying. You want to be able to know what you're paying. You want to understand what you're paying. And you want it to be reasonably small. But you don't necessarily want it to be zero. As an example, with Fidelity's 0% expense ratio index funds, they slightly underperform Vanguard's index funds that do have a published expense ratio that you pay. I mean, Fidelity still has a published expense ratio. It's published at 0. But there's other transactional costs, and there's other ways for Fidelity to make money from the money that you've given them to invest, and that's a whole nother show topic. But you want the best results, which is one of the reasons I love Vanguard. And I love Vanguard because of the lack of overlap, virtually no overlap in their U.S. index funds. Anyway, more than I expected to do again. I just can't help myself, apparently. That's going to wrap up the intro part of the show. We'll take a quick little break. We'll talk about the Polaris Plan Part 5. And then we're going to talk about religion. Old-time religion. The religion that seeks power, and the power that seeks religion to maintain its power. And you're going to be mortified, terrified, and entertained all at the same time. Enjoy.
I've always been an atheist. I simply, as time went on, I became more interested in American intellectual history, and I felt that the secular side of our history was very much underrepresented in readable, popular history books. So that's how I got into it. I am not an atheist propagandist in that I'm not interested in converting people to atheism. What I'm interested in is talking about what the secular side of our history has meant to the development of the United States.
And what has the secular side of the development of our history meant for the development of the United States?
Well, it's something that's not talked about much because we've got all these people going blah, blah, blah about how this was founded as a Christian nation. But it wasn't founded as a Christian nation, although we were overwhelmingly a majority Christian people at the time the Constitution was written. But what did the founders do in the Constitution? They made a break with all previous documents, including the state constitutions at the time after the Revolution, and they didn't mention God. They didn't say that governmental power flows from God. They said, we the people. The word God does not appear in the Constitution at all, which always astonishes my college audiences when I tell them that, which tells you how badly American history is taught. In fact, what's generally taught about the origins of the United States is everybody who came here for religious liberty, which is true. But initially, before we became the United States and were colonial America, the people who came here for religious liberty came here for religious liberty for themselves, not for anybody else. So the first thing the Puritans did in Massachusetts was try to get rid of everybody who didn't agree with them. However, the founders had a very different view, which is because there were already people of so many different faiths here, we needed to have no state faith. So they just left it out altogether of the Constitution. The First Amendment was made specifically to protect religion from government. The Constitution itself, which leaves God out, was meant to protect government from religion. The two go together.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
This Investing Skeptically segment is the Polaris Plan Part 5. Today we're going to talk about international stock funds, international stock index funds, and what I use and kind of why I use those specific funds and kind of some allocation recommendations. And this is probably right now the weakest, I don't know if I want to say weakest, the least well-defined part of the plan. And of course, this is probably the area that is most likely to change over the next 6 to 12 months, just because I just don't have that tight feel on how all this fits into the portfolio like I do with the U.S. market matrix mix covered in a previous part. And actually, I guess I'm going to throw in REITs in here because I can't do a whole segment on them. And I think I might do one more part to this sequence. Hopefully you're enjoying it to kind of wrap it all up and maybe fill in some things that I haven't talked about already, which is almost unimaginable, but it's true. So quick, the REIT, real estate, right now I'm thinking of that between 5 and 10% of all of your stocks. So again, in our theoretical $1 million portfolio, if 400,000 is in the cushion for whatever reason, which may or may not be the right number for you, but that means that 600,000 is in stocks. This could be between 30 and 60,000. I'm not that dead set on the exact percentage of the REIT. The Vanguard REIT fund has a nice feature where part of it is real estate stocks, companies that deal in real estate. And this is a bit of an overlap because almost all of those stocks will be included in the previously described U.S. stock matrix. But that REIT fund from Vanguard also buys individual REITs or invests in companies that deal with REITs that are not publicly traded as stocks. So it's, again, a different factor, different thing that goes up and down. Sometimes a few years ago, we had a situation where the market made 8, 9, 10% for the year, but the REIT fund made 25%. So it can be another way to have volatility or lack of correlation or diversification, depending on how you want to phrase it. As an example, ending June 30th of 2020, it's down 7%, while the total U.S. stock market is up 6.5%. Of course, that's as of June 30th. It's not today, not even close to today, but just to give you an idea of how things can be so different. Now on to our international funds. If your portfolio is not particularly big, a couple 100,000. And I know there are those of you who are listening who are thinking, I'll never get to a couple 100,000. With time and savings, you will, but this is addressed again to the person that's closer to retirement. But if that's not you, if you just have a couple 100,000, you may use the Vanguard Total Stock Market Index. That's VTIAX. It has a little bit of everything. Phenomenally low expense ratio, 0.11. 0.11%, I guess is the way I should say it. And that'll have you covered. However, if you are 400,000 or 500,000 or more, or like our example for this process, $1 million, I do like to break that up more. And one of the reasons, and it's still partly some of the reasons as I go through this, it's really heavily weighted into international large cap stocks. Should not be a surprise. And it's about 75 to 80% large cap stocks. And that's cool if they keep doing well, but not cool if the market turns against them. And of course, with just one fund, you can't do the rebalancing yourself within international stocks. So what I'd like to use is basically 3 different Vanguard index funds. And the majority of your international investment will be in the developed fund. And that's VTMGX, Vanguard Developed Markets. So that's going to have companies from Asia and Europe, maybe a few other countries around the world, but pretty much the countries that have long-going public traded stocks, open economies. You can see what's going on. You can have a high level of confidence that the companies are worth somewhere in the ballpark of what they're selling for. And it's very comforting. And that should be at least 50%, maybe 55 to 60%. If you want to go to 65, I won't even argue with that, of your international stocks. And the international stocks are about 25 to 30% of all of your stocks, which are, of course, in this case, 60% of your total portfolio. I know, it's a lot of percentages. So the bulk of your developed international fund, and then below that, somewhere around 25% of the international stocks. I like the small cap fund at Vanguard, the International Small Cap Fund. That's VFSAX. And that gives you that extra boost to know that you're not just in the large caps from the developed markets, but you have a little extra kicker for the small caps. And the third fund is the Emerging Markets Fund. The developed markets, by definition, doesn't really contain the emerging markets, but emerging markets can have large companies and small companies from countries that are emerging countries, the countries that maybe historically haven't been as well organized. It's not as clear what the companies are valued at, but there's a lot of potential because they're poorly run. They're not as modern, maybe, as us. And this is the single most volatile position in everything that I'm recommending. This is VEMAX. That's the Vanguard Emerging Markets Fund. And that could be maybe 1/5, 20%. If you're a little more conservative, 15%. If it just really scares you, 10, fine. But not really more than 20, 25% of your international, if you're really feeling the desire to be aggressive. And this is a fund that sometimes can make 70% in a 12-month period, but it can also have losses like that, where the U.S. stock market, usually the extremes are plus or minus 40% in a year. Here, the extremes could be plus or minus 70%. So you don't want, if you had all of your money in that and it went up 70%, boy, that would be awesome. But you don't know in advance. And that's why you want to control this risk and have a small part of that money in emerging markets. So those are one fund I mentioned that if you just don't have enough money or the desire to break this out, VTIAX, that's the total international. Keep in mind, I'm not in love with the weightings of that, but again, if you're aggressively growing your portfolio by adding money, it's not as big of a deal. But when you get close to retirement, I like 3 different funds. VTMGX, that's the Developed Market Fund. VFSAX, that's the International Small Cap Index. And VEMAX, that's the Emerging Markets Stock Fund. And that ends part 5. I think we're in part 5. And like I said, next week, probably I'll do a wrap-up, call it part 6, throw in some things. Maybe, if I remember, I'll discuss gold. So we'll talk about that a little bit and how it fits into the plan. And that's it. So I hope you enjoyed.
I like how you call homosexuality an abomination.
I don't say homosexuality is an abomination, Mr. President. The Bible does.
Yes, it does. Leviticus
18:22.
Chapter and verse. I wanted to ask you a couple of questions while I had you here. I'm interested in selling my youngest daughter into slavery, as sanctioned in Exodus 21:7. She's a Georgetown sophomore, speaks fluent Italian, always cleared the table when it was her turn. What would a good price for her be? While thinking about that, can I ask another? My chief of staff, Leo McGarry, insists on working on the Sabbath. Exodus 35:2 clearly says he should be put to death. Am I morally obligated to kill him myself, or is it okay to call the police? Here's one that's really important, because we've got a lot of sports fans in this town. Touching the skin of a dead pig makes one unclean, Leviticus 11:7. If they promise to wear gloves, can the Washington Redskins still play football? Can Notre Dame? Can West Point? Does the whole town really have to be together to stone my brother John for planting different crops side by side? Can I burn my mother in a small family gathering for wearing garments made from 2 different threads? Think about those questions, would you? One last thing. While you may be mistaking this for your monthly meeting of the Ignorant Tight-Ass Club, in this building, when the president stands, nobody sits.
The Phil Ferguson Show is for educational purposes only. Nothing said on the show should be interpreted as personalized investment advice. Your investment should be based on your situation, and you should consult with your financial advisor before taking any action. The show may contain ads. These ads are placed into the show by the hosting company after I finish recording and editing. I have little control over the content of the ads, and you should not assume that I support their products or claims. If you choose to support the show via the new Patreon page, that support does not create an advisor-client relationship.
You're listening to The Bill Ferguson Show.
All right, everybody. As promised, it's time for our guest interview. Professor of English, I think I have that right, Jeff Sharlet, an author of many books and writer for many magazines. The list is too long to even try to start. I do know that you have a brand new article at Vanity Fair, which we might talk about. Jeff, how are you today?
Well, I mean, that's sort of a strange question, the pandemic, but I'm alive and healthy and employed, so I guess I'm on the upside of the curve.
Excellent. I do want to mention that you have a brand new book, which is a different topic than what we're going to spend most of our time on, but it just came out, so we have to talk about it a little bit. It's This Brilliant Darkness, a Book of Strangers. Can you give us a couple-minute recap of what the book is so my listeners can go out and buy it?
Yeah, the book, This Brilliant Darkness is a book sort of recounting 2 years of reporting in my life, some of it related to our subject today. One of the long pieces in it, in fact, is about, is in Moscow and Russia, Putin's anti-LGBT crusade. But it's a selection of stories, not so much of true stories, reported stories, all woven together with photographs, everyday snapshots. It's 2 years of reporting in between a period. My father had a heart attack. I started taking care of him. 2 years later, at age 44, no indicators, I had a heart attack, just as I wrote what I thought was the last sentence of the book. So it's the kind of the people that I was looking for in a kind of a dark period. As I was sort of struggling. This was actually, had that heart attack back in 2016, the night of Trump's second debate with Hillary Clinton, which I watched in the hospital, hooked up to machines.
Oh, my.
So I could actually measure my blood pressure while I was watching this. But it's a story, it's a little bit of a story of that, and a lot of folks out on the margin. The real heart of the book is also a very relevant story to today, I guess, is the story of Charlie Africa Kunang, a homeless black man held down to the ground by 6 LAPD officers in 2015 and shot 6 times, including through the heart, muzzle to bone. That's what's called a contact shot. And another martyr in this sort of long war of police brutality. So that's the heart of the book.
Yeah, that's a lot of heavy subject material that is unfortunately relevant for today. And the other thing is, I just re-listened to The Family, which came out in 2008, and of course followed up by a similar subject titled C Street, The Fundamental Threat to American Democracy. And for those who haven't read either one of these books, I strongly encourage you to read them to get a kind of a longer view grasp of why a lot of the things that are happening today are happening and why they're happening, how they're happening, the sequence, and what is driving a surprisingly large portion of this. But I don't want to ruin all of that. But what I'd love to go back to, just like the book started many, many years ago, you went and hung with some friends in a really cool rich man's house Walk us through that, if you don't mind.
Yeah, that's the beginning of this book, The Family. And I should say, I would rather you read the book, of course, because I love books and reading. But if you want to watch the television version, you can. It's on Netflix. There's a 5-part documentary series that came out last year, directed by Jesse Moss.
And I'll even throw in further that people should read the book first and then watch the Netflix series. But go ahead. You're in the house.
That's the best. That's the best option. So and both begin with this sort of strange encounter I had almost 20 years ago now, not too long after 9/11, and the brother of a friend came to New York, and I'd known this guy for years. He'd always been kind of a jerk, but brother of a friend, and the friend's family was worried that he had joined a cult. Now they weren't afraid of evangelical Christianity; they were conservative Christians themselves, but he had dropped out of his career in finance, moved to a suburb outside of Washington. And was doing strange things. And so I met with him, and he said he was in New York after 9/11 to, as he put it, quote, survey the ruins of secularism.
Oh.
And I thought that was a very kind of frightening interpretation of what happened on 9/11. And he invited me to come be a part of this movement that he had joined, that I would come to know as The Family. At first, though, all I knew it was a group of young guys. I think 30 then. I was one of the oldest, living together in a house in a cul-de-sac in Arlington, Virginia, and they and around all the houses around them were also owned by members of this movement, all centered on a big, beautiful Georgian mansion called the Cedars, at which they hosted foreign heads of state, congressmen, leaders. Former Attorney General Ed Meese held a weekly event there. Laura Bush, who was then First Lady, visited. Shortly after I arrived, then Senator Jesse Helms, who was sort of the notorious, openly racist senator from North Carolina, came by, as did the new right-wing Prime Minister of Norway. I mean, it was this real sort of strange array of folks, and I didn't know what I was seeing. But I was just living with these young men as they tried to, as they put it, train themselves for spiritual war and train themselves for future leadership. They thought of themselves as a new chosen, a new elite. And they were sort of interns, in a sense, in this movement called The Family, which I would come to learn is the oldest and most influential Christian nationalist organization in Washington, going all the way back to 1935. It is the organizer of an event many mistake for an official government event called the National Prayer Breakfast, attended by every president since Eisenhower, foreign heads of state, most of Congress, seemingly banal event, which the organization itself refers to as a recruiting tool. And I'm quoting, only 1/10 of 1% of the iceberg of what they really are.
Yeah.
And that's true, as I would come to learn.
And I think one of the ways to phrase it is not only one of the most influential groups about religion and U.S. government, but quite honestly, in the world that you've never heard of. And they like it that way.
That's one of the things that differentiates them. They began back in 1935, in the midst of the Great Depression, which they saw was a punishment by God for the New Deal, for turning away from what they would come to call biblical capitalism.
Right.
And they thought, the founder thought that God came down and gave him this vision and said that Christianity had been getting it wrong for almost 2,000 years by focusing on the poor and the suffering and the down and out. That's not who God really cared about. What God cared about, according to this man, was those whom he came to call the up and out, those who are wealthy, those who are in positions of power, all placed there by God. And that to build the kingdom of God, you didn't need to convert the masses. You didn't need my soul or yours, Phil. You just needed these so-called key men. And that's what they dedicated themselves to. So they were never really interested in the kind of publicity of the tent revival of the televangelists. They had relationships with all those folks. But they saw themselves as sort of pursuing a very rarefied mission field in the terms of evangelicalism. And they came to embrace that kind of what began as sort of a disinterest in the public, in the end became a kind of very strange commitment. They described themselves as they started calling themselves a mafia-like organization. They referred to themselves as invisible. They said the more invisible you can make your organization, the more influence it will have, which is true, which is why we have lobbying laws, which they've routinely flouted. And now, when I was doing this in 2008, I wasn't the first person to report on them. What was interesting is if you go back, in the 1950s, Washington Post actually did an expose of the ways in which U.S. senators, representatives who were part of this movement were flying around the world to do this movement business, not U.S. business, but on the taxpayer dime. But nothing really followed up. 1960s, it was an expose. 1970, Playboy, of all places, great investigative journalist Robert Scheer, did a huge expose revealing that they were operating a fairly large, off-the-books, no-interest bank for congressmen, which is, of course, illegal.
Yeah.
And while I was living there with these young guys, Pulitzer Prize-winning reporter from the Washington Post, Lisa Getter, who was in our documentary as well, she spent a year working on a massive report for the LA Times. And I remember she actually came down and visited while we were there. They kind of ushered her out, and then former Attorney General Ed Meese led us in a prayer to strike down our evil enemies in the media, which is, sort of all prelude to the kind of rhetoric that is now out in the open, in public, in the age of Trump.
I mean, it's an incredibly intricate and long story. I mean, we're going back to the New Deal, where capitalism got knocked back a little bit, and government said, "Hey, we're here for the people," and kind of business and religion joined together to say, "Hey, we're going to take back charge, but we're going to do it slowly and stealthily." And they've been building for years and decades. And one of the things that you talked about on a regular basis that so many of these speakers would do is that they would talk about other world leaders that were successful and that they wanted to emulate, to copy. And these world leaders were people like Pol Pot and Stalin and Hitler.
Yeah.
What was so exciting about these leaders?
Yeah, first time I heard that, actually, I was visiting. They have a lot of property around Washington, actually, and capitals where they're active around the world. One of which is a sort of a 3-story brownstone on Capitol Hill, which they call the C Street House. It's on C Street.
Yep.
And where they give below market housing to congressmen, which again, you could that's an ethical problem. And I was there. Longtime leader of the organization, Doug Coe, was having a one-on-one spiritual guidance session with then Kansas Congressman, Republican Congressman Todd Tiahrt. And Todd Tiahrt was a fairly conventional right-winger, and he just wanted to talk. His big concern was that the Muslim birth rate, he thought, was higher than the Christian birth rate. And Doug Coe says, yeah, sure, that might be a problem, but he wants them to think even bigger than that. He says, think about it. He says, don't still think about the issues that we normally think of as a Christian right. What does Jesus have to say about Social Security? What does Jesus have to say about building roads? Everything should be filtered through Jesus. Now, you're saying, well, maybe you're a Christian, and you're saying, well, Jesus is pretty nice. That's not their Jesus. He wanted to understand the kind of strength of Jesus. So he said to Todd Tiahrt, he says, think of it like the mafia. Think of it like Hitler or Lenin. Think of the strength those guys had. That's what we have in our movement, the strength of, and this was his a saying that of Jesus plus nothing, which was a strange nihilistic phrase, Jesus plus nothing. Not history, not ethics, not theology, not the church, not accountability. When they look at Jesus, they don't see love, they see power. And that's the only thing that really mattered. And I would come to learn that analogy of comparing Jesus to Hitler, Stalin, Lenin, Mao, that wasn't just a poor choice of words. That, in fact, is a core teaching. It shows up throughout the organization. There's a video, I think it's now online. It was originally sort of leaked to me, but I think it's now online, of Doug Coe preaching to a group of leaders and talking about the strength of the bond between Hitler, Goebbels, and Himmler. And then saying, look at Mao, look at the Red Guard and the Cultural Revolution, how they would have members of the Red Guard, they would have them chop off their own parents' head. He said, that's the kind of devotion we need, which is terrifying.
Yeah,
and defenders will say it's just a metaphor, and I say that's one hell of a metaphor. You can't think of anything better than that.
Yeah, it plays into some of the current stuff that we're going to talk about for a few minutes, but it is a manly man's Jesus. It's a powerful Jesus. It's anyone who worked on Sunday, cast them into the fire kind of Jesus. And it's not about Republicans or Democrats, although they clearly have panache towards favoring Republicans, even if it's accidental. But it's not just American. In other countries, they want the leader, no matter how brutal, no matter how suicidal, as long as they kind of promise to toe the Jesus line, then they will help them get away with mass murder and an endorsement from the United States. And I think it was it Sudan that was in the book?
Sudan, Indonesia, Uganda, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Brazil, Argentina, Chile. I mean, so after I spent time there, I discovered that Jesus plus nothing, they're not interested even in their own history. They had dumped 600 boxes, hundreds of thousands of documents at the Billy Graham Center archives at Wheaton College, an evangelical college. So I actually moved out there and just sort of moved into those archives, which was a sort of parallel history of the 20th century. It only went up to the early 90s. But a parallel history. And here's correspondence from every major U.S. political figure of the right that you can imagine, oftentimes with foreign leaders. So you said Sudan. Most recently, former Congressman Mark Siljander, who's out in the Christian rights circuit right now. I like to say this organization is not a conspiracy. They don't break the laws. They make them. However, Mark Siljander did actually get convicted of conspiracy. He was using the family's, one of the many sort of shell 501c3 organizations, nonprofit organizations, as the federal government charged, to launder money from the absolutely murderous regime of Sudan, and he was lobbying to get oil sanctions lifted off them in the name of Jesus. It's what Jesus wanted. But throughout, I mean, it was just such a brutal, brutal history. The case I think you're thinking of is Somalia, though, not Sudan, because Somalia is the starkest one, where the letters were plaintiffs. This was a dictator named Saad Barre, and he was the last dictator before Somalia became sort of a lawless state, which maybe listeners know from the history of Black Hawk Down and so on. Saad Barre was an unlikely candidate for American Christian support. He described himself as a Quranic Marxist. Around the country, he hung triptychs, a triple picture, Marx, Muhammad, and him. But in the Cold War, things changed. The Soviet Union stopped backing him. He needed a new patron. And who should be there to help but a guy still on the scene today, Senator Chuck Grassley.
Oh, yeah.
Working for the family. Senator Chuck Grassley traveled to Somalia and said, if you will pray to Jesus, we can help. And Barre said yes, but unlike all the other leaders who would also always sort of speak in this diplomatic language, Barre just laid it out. He said, okay, I'll pray to Jesus, but here's what I want. I need a lot of guns. I need a White House meeting, and I need a hands-off policy while I crack down on some rebel groups in this corner of the country. And the answer was done, done, and done, and it was. The United States started pouring weaponry in. Barre suddenly had access to Washington, and the United States didn't make a peep as he cracked down on a rebel group in the north, but then in the south and the east, and laid biblical waste to his country. I mean, destroyed it. And Chuck Grassley just said, this is a man of God from Jesus has changed his heart. I mean, it can't get more cynical and dark than that. And I think sometimes defenders of the organization just say, oh, we're just bringing people together to be friends. with friends like these, you have to ask questions. But that story, so Chuck Grassley, maybe Chuck Grassley's the bridge to today, because Chuck Grassley's still around. But you recognize in this theology something that I think answers a question a lot of people have, which is how do evangelicals reconcile themselves with Trump? Well, look, if you can get on board with Saad Barre, you can get on board with Trump. Well, Trump is the theology of the family come home. They've been supporting dictators around the world, and finally they are. Now here it is.
This is just basically several decades of priming the pump, where you get used to someone who is a flawed vessel, but God is, and Jesus, I guess Jesus over God, is working through him, and it doesn't matter how many people die or get killed as long as this person projects strength and the love of Jesus, because that's what it's all about. Whoever gets killed in the process doesn't really matter. So when Trump comes along, he's like, sure, yeah, I'm with you guys. I'll say I'm with Jesus. I'll pray with you, which he did, the laying on the hands before and after he got into the White House. And then they just kind of let him do whatever he wants because he says he's cool with Jesus.
Yeah, and they're not really under illusion. You need to understand, they're not naive. They didn't think Saad Barre, who had suddenly, I mean, they would still use that rhetoric, but they understood that Saad Barre. I mean, these are some very savvy political figures who've been around a long time. They knew these dictators didn't necessarily come to Jesus, but it didn't matter because they were joining the family. They're of the belief. There's a saying that they have for the National Prayer Breakfast, of which the president always speaks. And which, if you watch it on C-SPAN, it seems like an ecumenical event. Everybody's invited.
I've seen it, yeah, sadly.
And one of the planning documents, they say, even the Quran can be read, but Jesus is there, infecting the world.
Right.
Which is such a strange metaphor, again, infecting, right? I'm sorry, infiltrating. They also say infecting. I confuse their metaphors. In that document, they say infiltrating. But their idea is that as long as you are sort of paying lip service to Jesus, the kingdom will be built. And that if you are powerful, and Trump is powerful, no way you did that on yourself. God chose you. God chose Trump. We hear this again and again, how many of Trump's supporters, former Secretary of Energy Rick Perry, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, have compared him to biblical figures, have said that he is chosen by God. Trump, of course, himself famously joked. He was joking. He said, I'm the chosen one. And yet the joke starts to not become a joke. The joke starts to become serious. And I think that's actually the theology that the family has. They know if they surround a figure with religious support, the movement will become religious.
Yeah.
Whether the leader is or not doesn't matter.
Yeah, and it all ties into, and again, this kind of loops back to way back when you were hanging out with those other young men. It's all about strength, power, and obedience. And if you do what the leader says, and obviously only way the leader can become the leader is because they were chosen by God, unless it was the black guy. But the leader is chosen by God, and you must do what he says. And the end results, whether it's in the United States or another country, can be catastrophic, because the last thing they'd ever want to do is say he's doing anything wrong, because by definition, whatever he does is God's will.
The end results not only can become catastrophic, they almost always are catastrophic. And what's interesting, the family likes to say we work with power where we can, build new power where we can't. And that's true. Unlike other Christian right organizations who scream every time a Democrat's in power, they'll try and cozy up to anybody.
Right.
They will try and cozy. And you know, there's people whom they're closer and more distant to. It's sort of like kindergarten fascism, you know, that rule, if you can't say something nice about somebody, don't say anything at all. They subscribe to that. They don't badmouth anybody. They don't give policy prescriptions either. They don't tell their senators how to vote. They are in this for the long game. This gets wonky. A lot of that kind of Christian rights stuff we see in the public eye is very sort of short-term organizing. the family is sort of from a theological tradition that emphasizes this idea called post-millennialism. So they don't believe the rapture is coming anytime soon. In fact, they don't believe it can come until they've established, until after the millennium, until there's 1,000 years of Christ's rule of the earth, right? So that's what they're working toward. I mean, they're old. They've been working at it for a while. They've been working for a long time. They're not particularly concerned. They are obviously very comfortable with fascism. They're not exactly fascist. If fascism serves their ends, then away they go.
Yeah, and this all ties into, segue into your Vanity Fair article, which, and this is not one of those 4 or 5 paragraph clickbait kind of articles, and it had the convenience of reading it to me, which I love because I can do other things. It was 50 minutes for it to be read to me, so this is a serious thing.
Oh, yes, right.
And this actually
on the Autumn app, yeah.
Yeah, you should have sold it as a mini book, for $1 or $2. But this brings us up to date to today with Trump and how he fits in with this ideology.
Well, there's two. I think the mistake that a lot of journalists have historically made about the Christian right is to think of it as kind of disdainfully. I mean, a lot of what the Christian right charges is that this is sort of elites looking down on them. There's some of that's true, and that's also blinded them to understand that the Christian right, like any social movement, has many different strands. So there's a populist front, and then there's the family, which actually has described itself as the avant-garde of American faith. And they don't mean that in the artistic sense. They actually mean it in the Leninist sense. The avant-garde is a political idea that a small elite goes ahead and shapes the way. So there's that Vanity Fair piece is really about the populist front. If you watch the final episode of the Netflix series, The Family, we get into the Trump administration and the family's embrace of Trump and the elites who are around him. But the populist front is in some ways leading the elites now. And that's what's really, really powerful and compelling to me is, it's not compelling in a good way, but like this we need to pay attention to, is things like QAnon, things that are made up. These are not elite movements.
No.
And yet somehow they're now shaping elite rhetoric rather than the other way around. That doesn't happen very often. And it's quite frightening. The elites were scary enough. QAnon is even scarier. There was a moment we saw if you looked at Trump's interview the other night with Laura Ingraham.
I did.
And I've been, the story in Vanity Fair, I traveled around to Trump rallies around the country. And I did this in 2016. I did it this time around, looking at these things as religious rituals, what's being said. I don't go as press. I don't stay in the press cage. I stand in line for 6 hours and I spend time with people. And what's interesting is that where Trump used to sort of flirt with and feed QAnon, he would throw little bits into his speeches that he had to know they were going to interpret as speaking to them. There was a pivot in that Laura Ingraham interview, in which, of course, now we all know he says there's dark shadows controlling Biden. There's the people you don't even know. He was now speaking straight QAnon conspiracy theory.
Right.
He wasn't alluding to it. He was giving voice to it. And he had gone from, I think, this is what I think is really interesting. There was something in the past when he's alluded to people controlling Biden, he meant Pelosi and Schumer. But now he says it's people you don't even know. He's, in fact, entered into the full paranoia of QAnon himself. It's as if he's sort of, I think of it as if, he's a con man who has opened the viral attachment to his own email, right? He now believes the story that he was until now using. He's in the nightmare of his own creation.
Yeah, the philosophy.
And we've seen that around the world. I mean, that's what happened to Saad Barre. I mean, I've seen that happen to so many of the family's client dictators. That's when the killing starts.
Well, one of the things I've heard in business is, it's all about marketing and promotion, but the one thing you must never do is believe your own bullshit. Because as soon as you believe whatever you say is true, I mean, as soon as it's spoken, it becomes the truth, that opens the road to ruin, because anything can happen because you say something, no matter how random or psychotic it might be. People grab onto it, and now you go, well, now I've got to go do that. And the Trump presidency has been...
You've lost the nimbleness of saying whatever you want. Now Trump really believes this stuff. Now he's locked into a certain path. Until now, remember, he would always... when I was attending those rallies, it became clear to me that if Trump... There was not too many issues that Trump could not 180 degree on.
Yeah,
and
he doesn't care.
A lot of his people would follow him.
Yeah.
Not only would he not care, they would follow him. If he told them tomorrow, you know what, immigrants are not the problem, they would drop immigrants. Guns and God, those are the two things that are non-negotiable for the Trump base. Those are the two things, and hating the media, most of all.
Yeah.
You'd go to Trump rallies, and if you had a volume meter, they would cheer for this, they would cheer for that, but then he'd say something about God, and they'd cheer louder. And then he'd say something about guns, and they'd really cheer louder. But when he said, look at those scumbags, and he'd point to CNN in the middle of the arena, the whole arena would turn around and scream with such ecstatic rage. That was the hate that they really dreamed about. And I think it's something that's also been, that was what I was trying to get across, among other things, in that Vanity Fair story. The overlooked is that for Trumpism, the real enemy within, the way that which they use, the way that so many regimes over history have used the Jews, right?
Right.
Is the media. It's not actually immigrants. They hate immigrants. But the enemy within has to be an invisible enemy, has to look like you. And to Trumpers, they believe they can tell an immigrant when they see him. They believe it's all a matter of skin color and so on. But the media, your own son or daughter could become a journalist. It could happen to anybody. They're like communists.
Well, and that's
the real hatred.
You're getting into Viet Cong territory where you're turning in your family members. I know the Germans also did that too, but the children come and report that, by the way, my mom or my dad said this word that they're not allowed to say, and the police show up and knock down your door, which I guess we're okay with too. But it turns very quickly, like you're saying, it turns very quickly from Jews or immigrants to some other group. And me as an atheist, well, I fear for the day where they say, hey, it's the secularists, it's the non-believers, it's the atheists, we got to go after them. I don't think that will actually happen. I don't think that will happen. I think plenty of atheists will be swept up in other categories, right? But the atheists are not a particularly exciting enemy. Sorry. Yeah. There's no thing there, and hopefully all of
the
this.
The atheist communist works. The atheist communist. That's good. That's good. Now you've got an ideology. You've got an agenda that threatens more things. But the sort of the absence of belief.
And right? Hopefully in
atheism is.
Is it about 60 days here? In 60 days we can make a change, right? Is that an option? Is that on the table still?
I don't know. I have to say, my cautious optimism has really shrunk.
Yeah,
and in 2016 I went I in April of 2016, before anyone was really saying anything about Trump. I had asked in 2015, as soon as Trump announced, I said to my editors, I said, let me go write about him. And at the time, they said, no, Trump's a joke. We need a funny writer, and you're not funny enough, Jeff, so you can't do it. It wasn't until April that they said, okay, this Trump guy might be serious. Go around. And I came back so terrified because what I saw was so big, so energetic.
Yeah.
And I did this again this fall, and what I saw was bigger, more energetic, more organized. And what dismayed me most is that when I came back, I would talk to folks and I would say, they didn't believe that these rallies were real.
Right.
And I think that happened because we had that Tulsa rally.
Yep.
That only 6,000 people showed up.
That was a nice debacle, but then they recovered.
They recovered on the spot. Because keep in mind, more people watched that than ever before. It was a flub. But the reality is the rallies are real.
Yeah.
When there's not a pandemic, people show up. I went to one with 22,000 in very democratic Broward County, Florida, 15,000 in Shreveport, Louisiana, another something 15,000 in Hershey, Pennsylvania. And I would talk to folks. I did a little social media survey. I just, asked folks, do you think this is AstroTurf? This is just paid actors? Do you think that they just make it look big on the camera with smoke and mirrors? Or do you think it's real? 75% of my respondents, 750 people, said A or B. It's fake. This is what liberals thought. It has to be fake. It's real. If we console ourselves by saying this is fake, then we're not ready.
Yeah. Go ahead.
I should get going, so I'm trying to sort of maybe I don't really have a whole lot of up notes on this, but except that this is a real struggle. I think looking, we started by talking about the family. Now we're talking about Trump. What we're really talking about is the convergence of conservatism. That's the scary moment when the elite and the populist front come together. It is a really powerful thing. It is a social movement. Social movements aren't just good. There can be bad social movements too. And we need to push back with similar force. And anyone who is saying, oh, great, Biden's up 7 points, nothing to worry about, even if they say, yeah, we should be active on it. Or if they're saying, well, Trump can only win if he steals it. I am here with bad news. Trump can win flat out right now. And it's all hands on deck, I think, to get him out. Because I think anyone who's I've spent 20 years sort of really working within the right. This is the moment they have been working toward, right? This is very much for them a big culminating moment, and what comes after is going to be something akin to what came after in Somalia and Sudan and Indonesia and all the other countries.
Yeah.
That the dictators that fundamentalism has supported have laid waste to.
I know.
On that happy note.
Yeah, I know your time is short, so I want to remind my listeners the brand new, well, at least a month or so, Vanity Fair article, Jeff Sharlet, his books, The Family, C Street, and several other books that are great to read. The Netflix TV series called The Family. It's pretty straightforward and simple. Covers a lot of the same stuff with some new updates. And anyone who's listening to this that's not scared and motivated to do something to end this, to change the direction, you really, I hate to say it, so it sounds like such a trope, you aren't paying attention. You aren't getting the big picture, and you need to get your shit together, and you need to not only vote, but you need to take 2 or 3 people with you. And Jeff, I know you have to run. Any last things you want to throw in? It's all open to you.
It's all going to be okay. I don't believe that. I don't have any last. We're not in the moment of last things. We're in the moment of let's look around and get busy.
Yeah,
because
the big busy thing that even if Trump had lost,
I don't like reporting on this stuff anymore. I now am. You said those like short 4 to 5 paragraph articles. I'm writing those for Vanity Fair now too. I want to be working on other subjects, but I feel like I have no choice but to keep working on this subject right now. There is no excuse not to be involved, and we're not here to talk about like whether Biden is the guy that you really were enthusiastic about or not. That doesn't matter. The threat of Trump is realer than anyone can grasp.
And it's not, of course, it's not just Trump. It's all the people that come with it. Jeff, thank you so much for your time. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Phil.
Thanks.
Take care.
Bye. Thank you again for listening to the Phil Ferguson Show. I greatly, greatly appreciate you being here. And I only just realized today that the Polaris Plan Part 5 is in an episode that ends with a 5. So I can always go back over the next year or two and tell people, start at 351 for Part 1, 52 for Part 2. You get it. And this is 355, and it has Part 5. I think I will have Part 6 next week, dare I say week. And I know I'm going to talk about gold. I'm convinced myself, and maybe some other wrap-up things about what you may or may not want to have in your portfolio. So we're going to do that. Hopefully my chat with Jeff Sharlet did not scare you too much, but I need to motivate some of you to get off your ass and go vote. I have talked to some wonderful people that have been doing protests around the country, and some of them think that protesting solves the problem, which it might. It might help, probably helps, but then they don't go vote. Are you fucking kidding me? Vote while you can, people. Vote while you still have that power. And I'm not just talking at the top. I'm talking the whole ticket. Learn who is up for election in your area, your precinct. And if you can swing it, go get elected for something. I don't care how small it is. Dog catcher, anything. Just get elected to something. And then once you're elected, if you find out you hate that, then don't get reelected, but do your part for a couple of years while you're in there. Because the more people that run that are secular, rational, I hope, rational thinking people, then a portion of them will go to the next level. And then a portion of them will go to the next level. And this is part of what religious leaders and power-hungry politicians have figured out long before us, apparently, that get everybody in and look for who might be that rising star and make sure you have power over them so that you can control them when they become a governor or a state senator or a U.S. senator or a U.S. representative or the president of the United States. So you want to do that. We want to have more people that don't have those connections to religions, those obligations to pay back for the people that helped them up the ladder on the way. Anyway, a little side rant there. But for you yourself, it's September of 2020. We're going to be voting in a few weeks. Do you know where to vote? Do you know how to vote? Do you know the specifics of how the voting is going to be set up where you're supposed to go? Do you have Clorox wipes that you can take in to wipe off your hands and the table every time you touch anything? Do you have the proper mask, to make sure that you're safe when you go vote? Can you vote in advance? Can you help somebody else go vote? Can you talk to your friends, make some Facebook posts, Twitter, TikTok, whatever, telling people, hey, by the way, I learned this. This is where my local voting place is. Here's when it opens. Here's when it closes. Or if you know about polling places that have been closed and you have to go farther, can you make plans to get there? Can you vote in advance? This is really, really important stuff, because if you don't like Trump, and I loathe Trump, and I like most people, but I loathe Trump, and I loathed him before he even ran for president, because he's just a vile human being. But he's president. I don't want him to stay president. I am very, very, very concerned that as awful as he is today, when he's elected a second time, he's going to be worse. Not just because he's now had allegedly not many strokes, but because he's a horrible person to begin with. So we don't want any more of that. And I don't want it to be where he wins a week after the election because of recounts in Florida. I want him to lose Florida and North Carolina and Georgia and Virginia and Pennsylvania and Ohio and Michigan and Wisconsin and Arizona. All these states that could go one way or the other. I want this to be a landslide victory. And no, I'm not in love with Biden, but I think he's going to do an adequate job. And I think adequate at this point is wildly better than what we're going to get if we have Donald Trump. And I think Biden knows how to build a team. And kind of in a way, he's proven that by winning the Democratic nomination. And I know a good chunk of my listeners are not happy that Biden is the choice. I get it. But here's where we are. You need to go vote. Vote for who you want. If you love Trump, go vote for Trump. I won't say that you shouldn't do. Well, maybe I'll say that you shouldn't do that. But it's your vote. Do what you want. I don't care who you vote for. Okay, I care who you vote for. God damn it. I don't want to care who you vote for. But I think it's such a clear and present danger that Donald Trump represents for our democracy, for our economy, for our very lives. The way that coronavirus has been handled. You could have really aggressively tried to put it in its place when it started, the spread of coronavirus, or you could have gone like Sweden and just said, fuck everybody. If you get it and you die, it is what it is. But no, we have a middle of the road lack of concern that creates this wibbly wobbly virusy kind of thing where it flares up here but not there. Some people tell you this thing, some people tell you that thing. And I still have Republican friends today that are convinced that a mask is useless and restricts the flow of oxygen, but yet doesn't block viruses. And they have absolutely no life experience. They apparently did not learn in high school that a molecule of oxygen, probably O2, two oxygen molecules linked together, is wildly smaller than a virus. And most of the time, that virus is attached to a globule of water. It's not just floating around free. It's on a particle of water. That's how it's most often spread. As I speak, I'm spitting out little particles of moisture which may have a virus in it or on it or sitting in it. And the masks can block some to most of that. And it's again one of these things where people just don't understand that even if someone does get sick while always wearing their mask, it's not a guarantee 100% that you'll never catch anything. But it's just way better than not using a mask. So use a mask to protect yourself, and use a mask to show the world you're not an asshole and you're doing it to protect them. Wash your hands, wipe down your groceries with soapy water, take some prudent steps. It doesn't mean that you're forced to live indoors for the next 6 months. You can go out. My wife and I just the other day did a nice little drive, phoned ahead to a restaurant, walked up to the walk-up window, which faces the outside, picked up our food, parked under a tree to get some nice shade, and we ate in our car and we had a nice time. It's not the same as going out with 10 or 20 friends or being with 1,000 friends at an atheist conference. I get that. But do what we can. Get out when you can, when it's safe for you to do so. And if, of course, your job requires you to work in the public, like at a Walgreens or a Walmart or some other grocery store, thank you for being there. I appreciate it. I understand that you may not have a choice. A lot of people can work from home, but a lot of people can't. So let's all look out for each other. Try to stay safe. Try to help those that you can. And prepare to vote. Make sure you know where to go. I'm going to wrap up with that, and I thank you for listening to the show. And I do hope to see you somewhere soon. Until then, ciao.